How do you beat a giveaway? You just don't, do you? Okay, you're all allowed to come to Brisbane anytime you like, and I'll take you to Strait, where my family come from. But I just wanted to start by going, Garen in name, Jojo Mumarongo, Garen in name, Garen in name, Jojo Mumarongo, Garen in name, Jojo Mumarongo. Garen in name, Jojo Mumarongo, I am Mamaranga, I am Mamaranga, Jagungun Marungo, Garen in name, Jojo Mumarongo, ay. That's a welcome song where I come from, and it's normally done at a Bunyinut festival where the groups from all around would come together and there'd be an exchange of both food and ideas and wives mostly, and all those kind of things that happen, and a real sense of sharing, and I think that's what the spirit of today is for me as well. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are here today. And I've just flown in today. I don't know if there was an official welcome yesterday or not, but I'm sure there would have been. And just to say that this country here is very significant, I think, as one of those places where that first lot of contact was done in a very sustained way between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. And that for, 200 and odd years, there's been a real sense of what that friction and learning has been happening here in this country, and that the Gadigal and the Darug have been at the forefront of what articulating that joining has been. As Sally was saying, my name's Wesley Enoch. In fact, it's Wesley James Enoch. Wesley after the Methodist ministers, James after the apostle, and Enoch is from Genesis 16, and given to my family by missionaries about 5 generations ago because they couldn't spell my Aboriginal name. And when I grew up, there was a sense that I was always going to be the doctor or the lawyer or the teacher. And at some point, my grandmother said to me, well, it was maybe when I was about 14, she said, there are many ways to teach, there are many ways to heal, and there are many ways to practice the law. And for me, art has become the most significant way that I could do those 3 things. My family is huge. My great-aunt is Kath Walker, Udru Nunakal, and through her, connections through to Stephen and David Page, and because their mother is my father's second cousin, and, you scratch the surface, and I think every Aboriginal person's related somehow or wants to be. And that sense of how we grew up was very much about the joining of politics and art, that we would look at those 2 things coming together from the very start, that there was always this sense of, as a family, we had a responsibility to look at our stories and beyond ourselves, to pass those stories on to others, to create both social and, I guess, artistic change in this country. My father's side of the family is Nunakal Nugi, as well as Gurrumpul and Kanju, and my father's family is from Stradbroke Island. My father's mother's family are up from Babinda and out through into Lockhart River in the north of Queensland. As well as I have a great-great-grandfather called Fernando Gonzalez, who's a Filipino fisherman who was shipwrecked on Stradbroke and married in, as well as a man called Fadhiaki, who came from Rotomar Island and married into the family about 5 generations as well as the whole, Scottish, Irish, English breed. I do this now because Andrew Bolt has taught us that we are stronger if we acknowledge everything, rather than trying to just be this kind of reductive sense of who our identities are. On my mother's side of the family, I have a great-grandfather who's Spanish, a great-grandmother who's Danish, and Irish and English and all those other things, because all you white people interbreed somehow. So it's not unusual in my world to have incredibly diverse cultural experiences expressed around a dining room table. I remember my grandfather speaking Spanish when he got angry at us for some reason, and my great-grandfather speaking Spanish, my great-grandmother talking back to him in Danish. And I going, well, I don't know, what's going on here, And my father then saying, just shut up and we'll get the goanna out of the freezer. So how do you grow up if you don't have all that stuff? It's interesting that I've always thought of my Aboriginality as an incredible strength. And I'll talk about that later, but the idea that I had a story to tell, that the important thing that pushed me further was not just that I had a craft, but I had an important thing to say, and I thought that it had impact in this world. The first cultural expressions on this country, I think, would have been song, the song of creation. And I was taught that all the songs that were ever going to be sung were created at the moment of creation, at the time before time, in the dream time. That the act of inspiration, as we talk about it now as artists, is in fact an act of remembrance. That our job as artists is to stand on the land and be free enough to be influenced by the history of this land. That if you like, every footprint you have is directly in the footprint of an Aboriginal person who's gone before you. And that our job is to stand in those footprints and remember the first stories, to be connected to the creation spirit, if you like. For me, that's incredibly great because it means you don't have to, there's no kind of pressure to be original. You know, being Aboriginal is enough. So if you take that on board and just go, how can everyone, you know, the Jermaine Greer position where if you get up in the morning, look in the mirror and say, how can I live my life as an Aboriginal person in this land? You go, think of yourself as that, freeing yourself up from having to think of everything as being new and fresh, but actually saying, I can connect to this place and have a spirit. Bye. Oh, what are you going to do? Those song lines, the things that were created at the beginning of time, think of it as a web underneath the nation, these songs that connect us all together. I'm doing a project at the moment based on the Seven Sisters stories, the star configurations. And about a month and a half ago, I went out to Cave Hill, which is about 3 hours drive southwest of Uluru. And we're driving along in these troopies, and these women are in the back, and they're singing along, and then, you know, singing quite quickly. And they said, you have to stop now because we've ran out of song. That if we don't sing up the land, it won't come up over the horizon and we'll fall off the end of it. So you think, you know, it's an interesting kind of way of thinking about these songs are a way of creating and connecting us all together, and that if we don't sing the songs, the land will literally fall apart. So for me, that's a wonderful way of thinking that song has always been here and will always be here. That the song also is reflected in painting, in dance, in story, that the song also reflects our genealogy, our geography, that we have found a way of putting art into the centre of our society, putting song, dance, visual arts into the centre of our society as a promulgation of ideas, but also as a way of educating the young and passing things down through generations. The oral traditions have allowed that to happen. So for me, I see that all art is equal, that the song, the story, the visual arts, the dance, all come together in a way to keep our law strong. If you think that that's the first song, the first act of cultural expression, you have to think of the next phase of it, if you like, which is the colonial cultural expression that happened. And if you imagine back to the first days of the first fleet arriving, that they spent the first 2 or 3 days getting drunk and basically raping women. And I can imagine a world where those songs were sung around campfires as they got off the boats, and they sung songs, sea shanties, and songs from their own places, as a way of trying to say, how are we asserting ourselves on this landscape? How will I fit here in the future? And I don't want to devalue that. I don't want to say that's wrong, that those songs should only stay somewhere else, but it's about how do they kind of connect here. And as culture kind of grew and as things started to grow here, I think about the influences of this civilizing effect of culture. That as we tried to build a nation, we looked at how do we look ourselves as being sophisticated, as civilized, and that the schools of the arts or the mechanics institutes around the nation in the 19th century in particular, how that kind of grew up as a way of civilizing this country, or saying this is some of the markers. You think about Melbourne doing all the tours, you think about, and more tours and more farewells and kept going, and J.C. Williamson taking shows around the place as a way of saying how can we express ourselves as a civilized society, as a sign of sophistication. And that as part of that, People learnt instruments, people learnt songs, people learnt social dances, and it was a sense of coming together, that the art was this social structure, as well as, I guess, ballet and higher forms in that way. I shouldn't say higher, because they're not necessarily high. And other parts of the communities, we're looking at the arts as being about entertainment and the carny heritage, if you like, of this country. We think of ourselves as a Western society with all the kind of the orchestras and the ballets and the operas and things, but in fact our real roots are in the carnival, the sense of overturning the status quo, that we are a bunch of mongrels that like to give everyone a bit of a dig. The idea of satire, about turning things on their heads, that's really where the bulk of our heritage comes from, and is often downplayed because it's seen as uncivilized. Into the early 20th century, and things started to change. I think with war, and especially with the economic upheaval in the early part of the 20th century, there became a sense of what is the official culture of this country. What was the nation building that happened? War and the blooding of the young generations created a need for stories, for heroes, for songs that bound us together, for things that gave us an ambition for the future, and led us then into the 60s and 70s with a need to structure that. And I think this is our undoing, and I'll talk about this a little later, but where finally Whitlam comes and says, we will create structures that support artists that are outside the market. We will create structures that start to say, we will fund this and fund this as a way of kind of social intervention. And not necessarily to respond, but to go in there and change the way a society thinks. So we look at this funding of this cultural expression, the official cultural expression, and joining these networks of already existing galleries and orchestras and dance companies and theatre companies. By the time we get to the 80s and 90s, I think we change the argument slightly. We start to go, what are the economic arguments for art? We start to become an industry. And I think this is an interesting thing to say, that the political motivations around those initial discussions around, I guess, intrinsic value of the art starts to shift away, and we say, what's the next step? What are we going to do next? And we start to argue about what proportion of GDP we are, what's our economic benefit, how do we push forward to demonstrate to the general public that we have economic worth. And we, I think, get hoisted by our own petard in that way, because in the end, we will always be a very small part of the economic pie compared to mining, perhaps. And government starts to tell us to value cultural expression through dollars. And that's not our world. The statistics, all the things that come out. I'm not saying that they're totally useless, but I think that they are not the future. It's not where we work. It's not our measure of success. And so we're trying to find our own measures. And the collective views of our citizenry in the country is, what are you about? Why should we support you? Why should we come? And can a policy, a government policy, tell us how to think? As an Indigenous artist, I have grown up with government policy. I was born 2 years after the national referendum that gave my father full rights as a citizen in this country. I started to go to school 3 years after they revoked in Queensland the right for principals to refuse to enrol Aboriginal kids in schools on the ground that, you know, they may not fit in or they might interfere with the learning of the other students. I grew up in a time when government policy was, we need to get more Aboriginal kids educated, and so there were lots of policies and frameworks to try to keep me in school. By the time I went to university, and my sister and I are the first people in my family ever to go to university. My father's one of 13, I'm one of 42 first cousins, and a huge network of Aboriginal family, and I think I'm still only one of 10 in that extended family to go to university. But there were government support to get me there. And then by the time I was looking at my employment possibilities, there was a government traineeship to look at, it was $120 a week. It was less than anything else that anyone else was offering. In fact, AB study, by the time I was going to university, was $15 less than OS study at the time. Don't know why, but there was something about that. And so when I was growing up, there were all these things along the way. You don't get someone like me unless you are prepared to invest in it. You don't get the next generation unless you're really investing through. And at this point, I just want to talk in a very personal way about my history. I was an incredibly violent child. At the age of 12, when I was suspended from school for the third time for literally picking up a desk and hurling it at a teacher and then pushing everything away, and I had to be held down by 3 teachers. I kind of went, I could see, with hindsight, I could see at that point there was a choice in my life, and that art was, to use the term, intervention in my life that made a huge difference. I think my mother and father saw a moment where I could have gone in a very stereotypical way down a path of destruction. They, uncharacteristically, like, my parents are not into the arts in any way, shape or form. They still don't know what I do. They just know that I end up being on television or my photo's there, or they come and see shows that I'm directing or writing and they go, what did you do with this? They don't quite understand. I think it's a pretty universal thing in the room where our parents may not understand what we're doing. But they said, there's something about you that needs to be said. So we're going to support you in what you're doing now, get you out there to do things. So as I was reaching my early teens, I discovered theatre, or theatre discovered me, and it kind of changed my life. And I say that because I see a dichotomy of home and what I call street. The culture of home. This is a place where my father would take us to Stradbroke Island, to Minjidaba, and he would give us a knife and a bottle of vinegar, and we would eat oysters off the rocks. We would know how to shuck an oyster right there and then and how to eat it. We would go fishing regularly there. My uncles would take us dancing every now and then, though we'd try to run away. And that there'd be a sense of culture in all that we're doing at home. We know how to say pretty much all the naughty parts of your body in our language, as you do. And there was a sense that was there. And I remember bringing a friend home, I think I was maybe about 8 or 9, and bringing a friend home, and him coming in and looking at my father and going, my God, your father's black. And I'm going, yeah, but isn't yours? I understood that women got pregnant and had a baby, and I thought that men just turned black when they had babies. That all these white men walking around just weren't fathers yet. And that perhaps these white kids with white fathers should talk to their mother a bit more, because, you never know what they've been doing. Why is their father not black yet? And the sense of the culture at home was very much a closed world. Then when you had to go to school, there was this straddling of values, a straddling of ideas, a sense too of perhaps racism. Conversations around Aboriginality were always, we studied Aboriginal culture as part of the Stone Age, and I think most people in the room would have at that time, as an example of Stone Age culture, not as living modern culture. So I kind of had to reconcile those two worlds in the way my father did. My father gave up school when he was 9. He was the eldest of 13, and he basically had to earn money to keep his family together. And if you think about the 1960s, my grandfather died, she had 13 children in 17 years. And when my grandfather died, my father was 16. And so to keep that whole family together was a massive thing. And I don't think my father got to grow up very well. By the time he had me, he was 20, and the violence and the alcohol abuse, the running away from responsibilities, the violence in the home that was experienced then, I think was a sign of that discord, if you like, the culture of the home and the culture of the street. I did some work in a prison when I was in my early 20s. And one of the things that I did was, I didn't know how to get, these kids were hard heads. They were, literally one girl just went smack to another girl in the middle of the class, and I was going, what do I do about that? Or you had to count all the felt pens so that, they didn't steal them and sniff them and all that kind of stuff. And I said, well, these kids had never been kids. And one of the activities I did was set up literally a cubby house. We built a cubby house. And we got inside and we said, okay, tell me a story your uncle may have told you or your aunt or whatever. And this one guy says, well, when I did my crime, I got on page 3 of the Courier Mail. And there's a sense of going, wow, that was fantastic. And some other kid went, no, but I got on the news. And so this whole story of trying to assert your narrative was out there. And I went, my God, this is interesting. That if you can't tell your story in a constructive way, you will find a way to get your narrative out there. When you look at the Redfern riots, which was not that long ago, 10 or so, actually a bit longer, 13 years ago, you've got to remember that here's a story that the home culture is that the police are picking on us, we have to look after ourselves, there's a sense of aggression in that world, and that the street culture is that Aboriginal people are no good or they always need to be looked after. And when you see those two worlds crashing up against each other, you find quite destructive behaviours on both sides of the narrative. And I think as an Indigenous person, my job is to create positive, constructive narratives, stories, ways of asserting ourselves on the public storytelling so that we as Indigenous people feel that we belong out there. And I think you can take this example beyond just Indigenous people. We have lots to teach you. We can start with this. But that whole idea, that was a joke, by the way. But we can start with this sense of how do you look at being part of the national story? And how do we balance and look at that? It's no accident that it's people like me who straddle two worlds that are having to articulate difference, who are trying to say, this is another way forward, that the air we breathe is always analysed. I think I pity my non-Indigenous counterparts, my peers, because they are not forced to articulate the difference in the same way that I am. We have to be clear about what makes us different, what makes us the same, and what our jobs are. And I take that as a really amazing thing to do. So it comes now to these three things that I really want to talk about. How do we value cultural expression? For me, that there is ongoing social value. That might be, the ties that bind us, the nation building. It might be the intervention in people's lives to make their lives better. It might also be the idea of the civilising influence and readdressing disadvantage, community building, also building access to this kind of cultural expression. It creates a sense of belonging. The idea of economic value, I'm not a great fan of it, but I think it's absolutely important to acknowledge. And if you'd like to know, these are old figures. These are about 6 years old. We're roughly about 1.3% of GDP in terms of the artistic practice, and about 26% of the tourist spend. How's that? And Indigenous cultural expression, the figures are a bit ropey, but about 73%, I think I've tried to work out, of Indigenous cultural expression in terms of money and investment in there is mostly in cultural tourism and economic development. So you just get a sense of where those kind of things kind of are landing. And it's really talking about how we are participating in the nation economically is always there. But it's this idea, and Julian Merrick talks about it in his platform paper, the idea of intrinsic value. How do we value the role of beautiful things? How do we value the role of that act of remembrance I was talking about before? The idea that as artists we can create things of beauty that do not need to be articulated as economically important or socially valued. But we can create beautiful things, a song, a painting, a story, a yarn, a dance, that sits in our culture in a way that just reflects us in that very intrinsic way. And that these three areas, I think, are the measurables that we should be looking at. Unfortunately, I think that final thing, the intrinsic value, is hard to measure. We as artists might talk about why it's important, but it's harder for the general public to get a sense of it. On the dawn of a new cultural policy, and I know the Minister was here yesterday talking for a very long time from what I hear, on the dawn of a new cultural policy, What is our role as artists to create this new language around value? How do we as a nation value our cultural expression? How do we say, as sport is very successful at, say that from the grassroots nippers down playing soccer on the field all the way through to the professional teams and the elite athlete, how do we as artists see that full ecology at work and not try to cut ourselves up, which I think we often do? That we look beyond just measuring the traditional ways of valuing cultural expression and think about creating a new language. I don't know what that language is yet. I think we're in the middle of it. How do you measure it? How do you find percentages? How do you find figures so a government can point to it and say, this is what we're doing and this is how we do it and this is why it's important? How do we look at that, I think, is our job as artists. I believe we have to spend our time finding those winning arguments to push beyond the traditional ways of looking at, of value placed upon us, and have more control over those arguments. When the next national cultural policy comes out, which I think is going to be just after the next election, maybe, that was a joke, we might see some real change. Or is it just more of the same? I think it's up to us to get involved in that process as well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.